This week, we're answering questions about pasture and rangeland management with experts from Dow AgroSciences. We'll be looking at various management practices that can help you become a low-cost producer. Joining our panel today are Pat Birch. Pat joins us from the northeastern part of the United States and is a product technology specialist for Dow AgroSciences. Travis Hurst comes to us from western Kansas and is a range and pasture specialist also with Dow AgroSciences. Bob Masters comes to us from Indianapolis. Bob serves as a product development leader with Dow AgroSciences. Glad to have you here, Bob. And finally, John Duran. John comes to us from the southeastern United States and is a range and pasture specialist as well. Thanks for joining us today, guys. Well, let's get started. We'll begin with you, John. Talk to us a little bit about what producers can do to improve their overall grazing lands.
All right. Well, thanks, Kevin. What we're really talking about when we talk about improving grazing lands is increasing forage production. Now, grass is the lowest cost way we have to feed our cattle. So anything we can do to increase our forage production will go directly to our bottom line. There's a few things to keep in mind. Number one is fertility. Fertility is incredibly important. A lot of times it's underrated or overlooked. But pull a soil test. Make sure you're applying the right amount. With fertilizer prices today, we want to make sure we don't overdo it.
That's right.
But then also monitor the pH, because if the pH is a little off, those nutrients we just applied in the fertilizer may not be as readily available to the forage for increased production. Another thing is, choose a grazing system. There are several grazing systems available. The more traditional, but actually the least efficient, is continuous grazing, where we just have big open pastures, all the gates are open, cattle just kind of roam wherever they want to. But a much more efficient way of grazing our cattle is either rotational or intensive grazing, where we divide those bigger pastures up into smaller paddocks, and we rotate those cattle around to actually take advantage of the grass where it's growing at that time. And then finally, we want to make sure that we manage those undesirable plants, weeds, brush, some undesirable grasses, etc., that compete with the grasses that we want to have there for valuable nutrients and moisture. So we just want to manage those undesirable plants and eventually produce more grass.
That's a helpful overview. Let's talk about pasture management. Pat, what would you offer relative to producers who want to do a better job managing their pastures?
Well, as John was indicating, controlling those undesirable plants, that's a very important component of this. And our overall goal is to increase the amount of forage produced out there. Sometimes, however, as we get into areas of the country where there's, the moisture is less limiting, we don't necessarily see an increase in the amount of grass that we're producing. We may, in fact, just have better access to it. Animals, because these weeds are controlled, are able to access the grass much easier. And so we've seen in our research work that actually the animals have greater access, and we can actually increase the amount of forage that's utilized on the acre. And of course, the overall goal there is to just increase the amount of beef that we're producing per acre.
Sure. Some people may wonder, how can spending money managing my pastures actually reduce my overall cost? Travis, what would you tell them?
Well, everywhere I travel and the ranchers I talk to, I consistently hear the message that ranchers want to take care of their grass, their ranch. If they'll take care of the grass will take care of them and their ranching lifestyle. And oftentimes this does mean spending some money and making some improvements. We see the number one cost in running a cow-calf operation is carrying the cattle, bringing home the feed and the groceries, and carrying that cattle for a season.
You bet.
And anything we can do to maximize our grass production so that we can use that grass to minimize feeding costs and maximize the time on the range, we've accomplished that goal. I think a lot of ranchers, well, it really depends on the guy's operation, but a lot of ranchers want to stockpile grass for periods of drought, periods of wintertime. Anytime that we can utilize that grass without feeding hay, we've accomplished our goal of lowering our feed bill for the year.
You bet. With diesel costs being what they are, that's becoming more critically important. We have to remember that we're grass farmers first and cattle producers second sometimes. Let's change gears just a little bit and discuss broadleaf weed control. Why should producers be concerned about broadleaf weeds, Bob?
Well, broadleaf weeds interfere with the productivity of our desirable species, grasses, as well as desirable forbs, or other broadleaf species that are desirable. And as a result, we need to be concerned about how we manage those broadleaf weeds. They compete with the desirable species for nutrients, water, for light, and therefore reduce the productivity of the desirable forage grasses that we're looking to increase. And the other issue with broadleaf species, broadleaf weeds, oftentimes they can be poisonous or toxic to livestock. So we have to be very careful to make sure that those species are controlled so the cattle won't eat those during periods of drought when they may be the only green herbage out there and cause problems for the livestock.
That's helpful. You know, let's talk a little bit about what are the primary types of weeds that specifically beef cattle producers should be concerned about, Pat?
Yeah, well, there's no shortage of them. There are a lot of weeds, and generally it kind of depends on the situation. We generally break weeds up into life cycle classifications. So you have annual weeds, such as your pigweeds, annual ragweed, some of the winter annuals, such as henbit, that can become a problem on, you know, especially after a drought period or in an area where you're reseeding grass. And then biennial weeds are ones that take 2 years to complete their life cycle, and there are a host of those as well. And these are some of the more high anxiety weeds that we deal with. Your biennial thistles, such as musk thistle, plumeless thistle, bull thistle, can all be a problem, as well as spotted knapweed is another biennial. And then your perennial weeds. These are ones that persist longer than 2 years, and they may include things like Canada thistle, tall ironweed, horse nettle, and these weeds, you know, as I said, persist in more than 2 years, and any one of these weeds can become a problem. Sometimes it may be on the producer's mind a high anxiety weed that they're dealing with, or a complex of weeds, and then there are other weeds in the background that can become a problem if we don't use a broad spectrum herbicide that's going to control all of those weeds out there. And the idea there is not to shift to another broadleaf weed problem, but we want to shift towards the desirable grasses that we want out there, and that is an integrated pest management approach. If we can encourage those grasses, they're oftentimes very competitive, and if we incorporate some of the things such as the fertility management and the rotational grazing, these things can encourage those grasses and keep a better stand out there that will resist reinvasion of other weeds.
That's great. Well, talk to us a little bit about noxious and invasive weeds. Why are beef cattle producers, or why should beef cattle producers be so concerned about those, Bob?
Well, noxious weeds are those weeds that are designated by law that must be controlled. So those are weeds that producers have to control just because it's the law. Invasive species or invasive plants are exotic. That is, that they're not native to North America in the context that we're talking about today. These were introduced from overseas as an ornamental, perhaps, that got into wild areas or pastures and began to expand their populations, or may have been introduced some time ago, centuries ago, as a contaminant in crop seed as European settlers settled the United States. Species like leafy spurge, for example. But one of the big issues with these invasive species, as exotic species, is that they were introduced without their natural enemies, the insects, the pathogens, etc., that kept those populations in check in their natural habitats. Here, they don't have those natural checks, so they can be very aggressive. They can displace our native species and really adversely affect the quality of our rangeland and pasture resources, not only from a livestock production perspective, but also from a wildlife habitat quality perspective as well.
You bet. That's becoming more and more important to a lot of ranchers who have a pretty significant income coming from that wildlife as well.